I want to start with apples, and I actually like to use the core and the peels when I'm making it's technically apple scrap vinegar because I don't like to waste those good apples. So when you're making the apple cider vinegar, whatever we start with, the first product that goes into it is going to be the quality of the end product. So apples are really high on the list for having pesticides and chemicals used on them, a lot of strains. So you want to make sure that you're starting with apples that are either organic or you know where they've been grown. So if they're from your own tree or from a neighbor, they haven't been using sprays, and that's what you're going to want to use to make your homemade apple cider vinegar, especially because we're using the peels primarily and the cores. We're using the scraps, but a lot of the outside of the apple that's been exposed to stuff. So wash your apple beforehand, make sure you get it nice and clean, and then you can use the peels. Now you can make this as small or large as you want in volume. So if you've just got the peels and cores from a couple apples, like this is what I'm going to show you how to do today from the beginning process, then go ahead and use the smaller amount. So you're going to, mason jars like make my world go round, you guys. So most people have mason jars on hand. So a glass container is best. Mason jars work well. And I like to use the wide mouth jars because we're putting things inside it. So go ahead, toss your cores, put all of the peels in there, and just make sure that it's a nice clean jar, that you've washed it with some hot soapy water and rinsed it well. So you're going to put that in your jar. Now the next thing that you want to do is we're actually just going to pour water over it. So there's two things. If you're just on regular well water like we are, we're on our own private well, then I just use my straight well water right from the tap. If you are on city water or water that has chlorine in it, then there's a couple of different things you could do. Of course, you could buy bottled water, or if you have a friend who has a well, you can go to their house and say, hey, can I get a couple cups of water? That would work. The other thing that you can do to remove the chlorine is you can either pour the water and let it sit for 24 hours on the counter, and that will remove the chlorine from it. Or you can boil it for 20 minutes and then let it cool, and that will remove the chlorine. So you've got a couple different options there. So all we're gonna do is we're just gonna take this and we want our apple scraps covered with water. So you're just gonna pour those in there with your water. Then what you want to do is it needs to be able to breathe. So this is actually a fermented food. Apple cider vinegar is fermented, and so many of us have been hearing fermented foods are really good for us. They're not just a form of food preservation from way back when, but the actual fermenting, it has that good bacteria in it and is very beneficial for our health. So apple cider vinegar is technically a fermented food. So then what we want to make sure we do is you need something that's breathable. So you can use cheesecloth. You can use, this was a paper towel that I did on this first batch. Coffee filter works great. You just need something that's breathable, and you do want to cover it because hello, fruit flies, right? This attracts fruit flies, and this time of year, my goodness, I think over the past 2 weeks, I've canned about 60 pounds of different fruits, peaches, pears, and apples. So fruit flies have been making a home in my kitchen, and I'm going to show you a tip to get rid of those as well. So we're going to cover this up. So you could just use this like this, and then you're going to want to just use a regular band. So I just have my a band here just to keep it down. You could use a rubber band, anything. Basically, it's just to keep this so that little fruit flies and contaminants don't get in it. So then what you're going to do is you're just going to set this jar somewhere on the counter where you can kind of see it and keep an eye on it. Not a really big deal. And you're going to let this ferment for about 2 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks. You can have a little bit of leeway there. We're going to let it ferment. So this right here, this big jar, has been going for about 2.5 weeks now. So there's a couple of things that you're going to want to look for when it's fermenting. And one is the presence of bubbles. So the presence of bubbles is really good. It means that it's active and it's fermenting. It's also started to change color. It's not really that nice dark vinegar yet, but it is darker than just your plain waters. And then, of course, the smell. So it should start to smell a little bit sour, not a bad smell, but it should start to smell like a very weak vinegar. So those are our things. Now, there's a little bit of troubleshooting that I want to talk about with you. So some people have experienced when they're doing their apple cider vinegar that they've gotten some mold on top. So there's a couple of tricks that you can do. One is if scraps of the apple are above the surface of the water, they may start to grow mold. So it's really important, and this is true with any type of fermenting that you do, vegetable fermenting, that you keep all of the food beneath the surface of the water. So an evaporation will happen because this is not a sealed lid, right? We need it to be breathable. So there's a couple things that you can do. You can get a little weight. So this is just a little cup. It actually came with a fermenting kit that I got a while back. So what you can do, as I will show you on this one, is you're just going to use this, and it's clean. We've already cleaned it. And you're just going to put a little bit of water inside the cup that will give it some weight. And then you're going to set it inside. And so you can see that that is pushing down the apples, the contents, and it's keeping it beneath that water surface. So that's probably my best tip. Now, some people, you can get like glass weights, basically anything that's clean and that's heavy enough to keep it beneath the surface of the apples. And I actually have it here. Another trick that you can do, and this is especially true if you don't have that little metal one, is just use a smaller glass jar. And that's one of the benefits of using the wide mouth jars, like I mentioned. Then you can put something smaller in there. So I just put a little bit of the water in here to weigh it down, and then it just keeps this below the surface level. So if you have ever had mold issues when you were making your apple cider vinegar, that's usually the culprit. And of course, we want to start with, nice clean jars and everything beforehand when we're making it. So when you're doing fermenting, especially with the apple cider vinegar, it's actually pretty forgiving. So if you start to develop on the top, see there's a couple pieces that kind of floated up and you're just like a week or two in and you see them and you're like, oh no, they've got like a little bit of mold, or there's a little bit of film, or it looks kind of funny. Just go ahead and remove those pieces and watch it over a week. Now, if it continues to mold and it spreads, then you're going to have to toss it out. But many times, see, like this piece right here was close to the surface. This one had kind of gotten up there and it's a darker brown. There's no mold on it, but you could just simply remove it. However, this has been fermenting, like I said, for about 2.5 weeks now. So after it's fermented and you've got the visible action of the bubbles, and then you've started to have color change, and you can smell that it's starting to smell like vinegar, then what you want to do is the second ferment. So with the second ferment, what we need to do is we actually will drain out all of the solids, so all of the apple pieces will drain out, and then you can just discard them. You can feed them to the chickens, feed them to the cows, the pigs, whatever it is you want to do with them, toss them in your compost pile, doesn't matter. And then you will keep the strained vinegar and you'll put it in a jar. At this point, you can put a lid on it. And I really like these, are really nice because they don't, the metal bands and lids are 2 pieces, and you can use those if you want, but I found that those tend to get kind of rusty, and then when you go to take them apart, you've got all this clattering stuff. So I really like for my non-canning projects to use these white lids, and they just screw down. They're 1 piece, and so you put that on top for the second ferment. So it doesn't need to breathe on the second fermenting part. So I just use just a large Pyrex bowl here, and then just your regular strainer. And then you're just gonna pour it through, and we're just gonna pour that in and let it drain. So it's also important to remember, depending upon the size of the jar that you use. So this is a 1/2 gallon mason jar, and I won't get that much vinegar out of it because there's those solids in there. So usually you get about half of the amount of liquid of the jar, especially if it's full, there. So then that's pretty much all the way through there. So I ended up getting that's about 5 cups worth here. So what I'll do is I will toss out these old scraps and pour it back in here and put the lid on, and then that will continue to ferment. And you can let it sit and just continue to ferment and become a lot stronger vinegar, because the first point right now, this is not full strength. So this isn't really strong enough to act as vinegar. We need it to ferment for quite a bit longer. And it can just keep fermenting and getting stronger. I've actually got a little bit of apple cider vinegar left from last year. Okay, so this is from last year. And one of the really good things that you want to look for, and this is especially true if you don't have enough apple scraps, or you're not making enough apple cider vinegar to take you through the whole year, and you want to be able to purchase some from the store, is you want it to have what's called the mother in it. And you will see that develop. Now at this point, at the first straining, you're not going to see the mother in it yet. It's too young. It's not strong enough. So what the mother is it's you'll kind of see and hear, see what dark this is. This is from last year. And it's kind of cloudy. You'll see cloudy, and you can actually see some little strains and particles. It's kind of almost cobwebby appearance at times. Well, that is the mother, that's the healthy strain of all of the good bacteria. And we really like that because now a lot of times when we're purchasing things in the store, we think that we want it to look really clear and really nice, but that's not the case with vinegar because a lot of the good stuff has then been strained out in it. And we actually want the darker color because that's a stronger, better vinegar when it comes to apple cider vinegar. So as it sits, then it will continue to darken up. And like I said, this is from last year. So this has been on its second ferment for almost a year. And that's fine with vinegar. And you can really tell now after you do the second ferment as well. So sometimes people will notice they don't actually have mold on that top layer. And it's usually when it's in the apple scrap form. So it's the first ferment when you still have the scraps in there. So you can just skim off if there's a layer on the top, just skim it off and let it keep going. So when I did this one, there was a little bit of a film on the top last year. I just skimmed that film off and then we strained it and put it in for its second ferment and it's been absolutely fine. So a lot of times you have a little bit of forgiveness room when it comes to making the apple cider vinegar at home. And it smells really vinegar. So it should have that sour odor. So you've got your 3 telltale signs there that it's actually making vinegar. What are the best apples for making vinegar? Whatever apples you have on hand, friend. So I have made them from, this batch right here is going to be Gravenstein apples, which I have to tell you, Gravenstein apples are my favorite apple of all time. They make the best apple pies, they make the best apple sauces, and they can be harder to find. So if you have friends who have a Gravenstein or you're going to be putting some trees in, if you can get a Gravenstein, they are best flavor-wise in my opinion. I love them. You could use a whole apple if you wanted to, but I like to get as much from my produce and the items that I've got on hand as I can. And so I just use the scraps. If you want to use a whole apple, you can do that. And a lot of people will also like to do, so when you're making apple cider vinegar with any kind of ferment, it's feeding on the sugars in the apple. So that's what at first the alcohol it's feeding on yeast and sugar, right? Which we already have in the presence of the apples. So a lot of times to give it a jump start, some people like to add in a little bit of sugar or a little bit of honey, or if you've got a batch of already vinegar that has the mother in it, you can add like a couple of teaspoons of this in there to kind of give the colony a jump start and help it to grow. I have never done that and I've had it be just fine. So I generally don't add sugar to my water. But you can do that if you want to, and you can also do a couple jars at once and see which one starts to perform the best, so you can do some testing. But personally, I haven't had to add sugar, honey, or any kind of starter batch for my other ones, and it's just done just fine for me. Having homemade apple cider vinegar at home is for so many different reasons. Now, typically we think of having apple cider vinegar when we're making, salad dressings or maybe a little bit of baking. But if you are into making a natural home, apple cider vinegar has got so many different uses throughout your home. In fact, I just wrote a blog post that just went live this morning, so you can catch that. I've got over 28 ways to use apple cider vinegar, and it is from everywhere in your kitchen, in your cleaning cupboard, natural remedies, and in your health. So I will just tell you, I am not a doctor and I'm not a nutritionist, but there has been some studies that have came out, and this study was actually done on humans, and apple cider vinegar can help the body's response to blood sugar and to keeping blood sugar levels low, which is pretty amazing. So if you want to catch that article, and I've got links to all of the different sources and the actual data that's been done on these studies with using apple cider vinegar, and like I said, 28 ways, you can go to melissaknorris.com/ACV. Now I want to show you one of those tips that I share in the article. I'm going to show you right here. So fruit flies are a huge pain, right? Fruit flies drive me batty this time of year. It seems no matter what I do, I always have some that come in the house. So apple cider vinegar is the best way that I've found in order to trap and actually effectively kill and trap the fruit flies to get them out of my kitchen. So what I'm going to show you is the proof is in the pudding, we always say. Well, the proof is in the jar with the apple cider vinegar. This jar right here, I made this little fruit fly trap with apple cider vinegar, and I'm not kidding you guys, there is probably, I had like a mini infestation going on. I'm going to say 100 fruit flies. I don't know if you can see them. They're the little dark things in there on the camera. I'll try to get that down. But this was in 24 hours. It was like my whole kitchen, and they were all gone in 24 hours. So what you do It's super, super easy. Just take a glass, you can take a glass bowl, just a little one, or you could take like that, like I did. And then you just take some of the apple cider vinegar. So the apple cider vinegar, actually the component in it is acetic acid. So it is acidic, but in the body it can help to balance your pH levels. And a lot of times when people have issues in the body, it's because their pH levels are actually off, and apple cider vinegar can help. And I talk a lot about that in the article as well. To catch the fruit flies, it works so good. So you just pour it in, and you just want enough just to cover the surface area. You don't need a ton. And then this is what we do, is we take a little bit of dish soap, and you just want to put a couple of drops on the top, and you could kind of swirl it around with your finger or whatever to kind of distribute it evenly on the surface. And the dish soap is great because it creates a little bit of a film on the surface. So when the fruit flies, because they're attracted to the smell, when they get in there, they fall down inside, and that soap helps create a little bit of a film so they can't easily fly back out. It kind of keeps them trapped in it, and then they drown, which sounds kind of diabolical. But if you have fruit flies, you know how much they drive you batty, and so it's a very good thing. Which brings me to one of my other things that you'll want to do too, especially this time of year. And this is tip 1, and then we've got tip 2. They're of those 28 tips in that post that I was telling you about. And that is if a lot of us are bringing in our winter squash harvest. So a lot of us, the produce is coming in out of the garden, or you might be picking it up at a farmer's market if you're not growing it yourself. So one of the things that we can do to help extend the shelf life of those root cellar type winter squash, so think your pumpkins, butternut squash, spaghetti squash, acorn squash, all of those winter squashes, Howard squashes, all of those. Well, when you bring them in, is take just a towel dampened with some apple cider vinegar and wipe the outside of it down. So any of the bacteria or dirt or germs or anything that's on the outside that would start to break that down faster, by wiping that down with some of the apple cider vinegar, and then of course let it air dry before you put it on the shelf or whatever system you use for storing your winter root vegetables or the winter squashes like that. It helps extend the shelf life. And I've always done that. And another tip too, if you're picking it yourself or you're going to pick them out, always get the produce that has the stem still on it, because if the stem is on it, then the oxygen can't get out inside as easily and start to break it down. So if the stem is on those winter squashes, they will actually last a lot longer. So that's my tip for you. If you're picking them or harvesting them or getting them somewhere else, you'll want the stems on. So by keeping the stems on, wiping down the outside with the vinegar, just in my kitchen, you guys, I have had spaghetti squash on the shelf last for 5 months because I don't have a basement and I don't have like a real root cellar yet. So that is how long I've gotten my shelf life by doing those 2 tips with my homemade apple cider vinegar on our root cellar vegetables. So that is like super good because we all want our vegetables to last as long as possible, right? Nobody wants to be wasting those darlings.